July 14th, 1943. United States Army Field Hospital, Bizerte, Tunisia. Oberarzt Friedrich Reinhardt stared at the refrigerator. He had been a prisoner of war for 11 hours. His medical unit from the 10th Panzer Division surrendered near Matur after 3 days without food or ammunition. American MPs loaded him and 42 other German medical personnel onto trucks, drove them to this coastal city. Reinhardt expected interrogation, expected a prison cage, expected perhaps a beating. Instead, an American captain asked him a question. "Dr. Reinhardt, would you help us treat wounded? We have more casualties than surgeons, German and American both. We need skilled hands, regardless of uniform." Reinhardt agreed immediately, not from altruism, from a doctor's inability to refuse surgery. They gave him surgical scrubs, assigned him to a tent operating theater. For 6 hours, he worked alongside American surgeons repairing shattered bodies. The work was familiar. The techniques were standard. But something was wrong. Something was impossible. American soldiers kept surviving. Reinhardt watched a sergeant brought in with his left leg nearly severed. Abdomen punctured by shrapnel. Blood loss so severe his skin looked like grey paper. In any German field hospital, this man would be classified hoffnungslos, hopeless. They would give him morphine, make him comfortable, let him die while they worked on salvageable cases. The American surgeons did not hesitate. They started a transfusion immediately, operated for 3 hours, now that Sargent was in recovery with stable vital signs. This happened again, and again, and again. Soldiers who should have died on the table were surviving. Soldiers who should have gone into irreversible shock were stabilizing. The American mortality rate for severe trauma seemed to be half of what Reinhardt knew was normal. At first he thought it was superior surgical technique, but he had trained at Heidelberg University, had studied under Germany's best surgeons. The American techniques were good, but not miraculous. The difference was not in how they operated. The difference was in what they had before they operated. Blood. They had unlimited blood. During a break between surgeries, Reinhardt walked outside to clear his head. That is when he saw it. A refrigerator, sitting under a camouflage net next to the supply tent. A standard commercial refrigerator unit, running off a portable generator. Reinhardt walked closer. Inside, rack after rack of glass bottles. Each bottle contained pale yellow liquid. Each was labeled with a number, a date, and the words plasma human type O. He counted the bottles. 43. No, wait. More racks in the back. He pulled the door fully open. 200 bottles. At least 200 bottles of plasma, sitting here in a field hospital 20 miles from the front lines. Reinhardt's hands began to shake. He had been a military surgeon for 4 years. In that time, he had performed perhaps 30 blood transfusions, total. Each one had been an ordeal. Find a donor, type their blood, draw it directly, transfuse it immediately. The entire process took hours and required multiple doctors. You could only do it at a rear area hospital with proper facilities. But these Americans had 200 units of ready-to-use plasma in a refrigerator, just sitting there, available instantly, for anyone who needed it. A voice behind him spoke in German. Impressive, is it not? Reinhardt spun around. The American captain who had recruited him stood there holding a cup of coffee. The captain gestured at the refrigerator. That is just this week's supply. We get a shipment every Monday, usually about 300 units. We will use most of it by Sunday. 300 units per week. in one field hospital. Reinhardt heard himself ask, "How? Where does it come from?" The captain smiled. "From America. We have collection centers in almost every city. People donate voluntarily. The blood gets processed into plasma at laboratories, shipped across the Atlantic, distributed to hospitals. The whole system works like a factory assembly line. This particular batch was collected in Detroit 3 weeks ago." Reinhardt did the mathematics in his head. 300 units per week meant approximately 1,500 soldiers could receive transfusions monthly from this single hospital. The entire German army in North Africa had perhaps conducted 3,000 transfusions in 6 months. This one American field hospital was doing half that volume in 30 days. "That is impossible," Reinhardt said quietly. "The logistics alone, the cost, the organization required." The captain shrugged. "We are pretty good at logistics. Want to see something really impressive? Follow me." They walked past the surgical tents to a smaller tent marked blood bank. Inside, a young medic was unpacking a crate. The crate had come from a refrigerated truck. The medic pulled out bottle after bottle of plasma, checked each label against a clipboard, stacked them carefully on shelves. The tent held perhaps 1,000 units. "We also have whole blood," the captain said. "Type A, B, O, AB. All typed, tested, refrigerated, ready to use. The whole blood only lasts about 3 weeks, so we use it first. The plasma lasts months." He pointed to a logbook on the table. "Last month, this hospital performed 417 transfusions. 417. Our mortality rate for severe trauma is currently running at 18%. He looked at Reinhardt. "What is yours?" Reinhardt knew the answer. He had compiled the statistics himself for the 10th Panzer Division's medical service. 37%. More than a third of severely wounded German soldiers died. The Americans were losing less than 1 in 5. "A 20% difference," the captain said quietly. "That is the blood. That is the plasma. We save 20 soldiers out of every 100 that you lose. Not because our surgeons are better, though they are quite good, not because our techniques are superior, but because we can replace the blood they lost before their bodies give up." "How many hospitals have this system?" Reinhardt asked. "Every American field hospital in North Africa, every hospital in Sicily, every hospital in England preparing for the invasion of France, every hospital ship, every battalion aid station carries plasma. Every medic has training in plasma administration." He paused. "Dr. Reinhardt, we have industrialized blood transfusion. That refrigerator you saw represents a supply chain involving millions of American civilians donating blood, dozens of laboratories processing it, thousands of trucks and ships transporting it, thousands of medical personnel administering it. The entire system exists for one purpose: to make sure that no American soldier bleeds to death because we could not get him blood fast enough." Reinhardt walked back outside. He needed air. The implications were crushing. Germany had lost North Africa. Everyone knew that. The Wehrmacht had fought brilliantly, but American and British numbers had overwhelmed them. Tanks, planes, artillery, supplies. Germany could not match Allied production. But Reinhardt had assumed that medicine at least was universal. A German surgeon and an American surgeon faced the same challenges, saved the same percentage of patients, worked under the same constraints. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. The Americans had not just brought more tanks to Africa. They had brought a medical system that operated on a scale Germany had never imagined possible. They were saving soldiers that German doctrine classified as unsavable, and they were doing it not through superior skill, but through superior organization, through industrial capacity applied to blood itself. Reinhardt thought about the soldiers he had lost. Klaus Weber bled out on the table at Kasserine Pass. Johann Stein went into shock during evacuation and died before reaching a hospital. Friedrich Metz would have survived with a simple transfusion, but there was no blood available. Dozens of men, hundreds of men, all dead because Germany could not organize blood donations efficiently. That evening, Reinhardt was assigned quarters in a tent city for German medical POWs. The tent held 6 German doctors, all captured in the final collapse of the Afrika Korps. They sat on cots, smoking American cigarettes, which the guards distributed freely, and discussing what they had seen. Dr. Hans Müller, who had served with the 21st Panzer Division, spoke first. The plasma. Did you see the plasma? They have thousands of units just sitting in refrigerators. We rationed morphine. They ration nothing. Dr. Werner Klug, from the 90th Light Division, added, I watched them treat a private with a sucking chest wound. They gave him 2 units of plasma immediately, operated, then gave him whole blood during surgery. 4 hours later, he was conscious and asking for food. That man would have died in any German hospital. No question. But where does it come from? Müller asked. The blood, the plasma. To supply an army this size, they would need millions of liters. Where do they get it all? Reinhardt answered. From their civilians. They donate it, voluntarily. The American captain told me they have thousands of collection centers across America. People just go and give blood, for free. The tent fell silent. The idea seemed almost obscene. In Germany, blood donation existed, but it was small-scale, organized by hospitals for specific patients. The concept of millions of people voluntarily giving blood to strangers to be processed industrially and shipped around the world was alien. Müller spoke quietly. If the Americans can do this with blood, what else can they do? We knew they had more tanks, more planes. But this is different. They have turned medicine into mass production. They have made saving lives an industrial process. Dr. Otto Schwarz, the oldest among them at 54, had been mostly silent. Now he spoke. I have been a surgeon for 28 years. I served in the Great War. I have performed surgery in field hospitals, in bunkers under artillery fire, in conditions you cannot imagine. And I will tell you something. Germany has lost this war, not because our soldiers are not brave, not because our officers are not skilled, but because we are fighting a nation that has mechanized everything, including mercy. They mass produce salvation, and we cannot compete with that. The tent fell silent again. Outside, they could hear American trucks moving supplies, generators running, voices calling in English, the sound of an army that never ran out of anything. Reinhardt lay on his cot that night, unable to sleep. He kept thinking about the refrigerator. 200 bottles of plasma. Next week, 300 more. And this was just one hospital among dozens. The mathematics were staggering. If every American field hospital had this much blood available, and if there were 50 such hospitals, that meant tens of thousands of units in the supply system at any given moment. The entire German military medical service probably had less than 500 units of stored blood in all of Africa before the surrender. America had built a blood supply system larger than Germany's entire medical infrastructure, and they had done it in less than 2 years. October 7th, 1943, Baxter Laboratories, Chicago, Illinois. Obergefreiter Klaus Fischer stood in the factory doorway, frozen in disbelief. Fischer was a German prisoner of war, captured in Tunisia in May 1943, shipped to a POW camp in Illinois, assigned to a labor detail at this pharmaceutical facility. The American guards told him he would be working in a medical supply factory. They had not told him what he would see. The factory floor stretched before him like something from a fever dream. 4 rows of centrifuges, 24 machines total, spinning constantly. Women in white coats moving between stations with mechanical precision. Conveyor belts carrying glass bottles. The hum of machinery so loud it made his teeth ache, and everywhere, blood. Not spilled blood, not the blood of battlefields, but blood in bottles, thousands of bottles, moving through the facility like an automotive assembly line. An American sergeant, a man named Howard Mitchell, who spoke decent German, stood next to Fischer. "Welcome to Baxter. You will be working in the supply warehouse, moving crates, loading trucks. Nothing complicated." Fischer could not stop staring at the production floor. "What is this place?" Mitchell smiled. "This is where we process blood plasma. We turn donated blood into medicine that saves soldiers' lives. This facility produces about 1,200 units daily." Fischer's mouth went dry. 1,200 units daily. He did the mathematics automatically. That was 8,400 units weekly, 33,600 units monthly, more than 400,000 units annually from one facility. Fischer had been a medical orderly in the Africa Corps. He knew German military medical logistics intimately. The entire German military medical service had received perhaps 30,000 units of plasma during the entire war. This one American factory was producing more plasma in 1 month than Germany produced in a year. "That is impossible," Fischer said quietly. "The logistics alone, the blood supply, the processing capacity. No nation could organize this." Mitchell's smile faded. "Son, America has 5 facilities like this one. Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, San Francisco. Combined output is about 35,000 units weekly. We've been running at this capacity since early 1943. By the end of this year, we will have produced over 1.8 million units of plasma." Fischer felt his legs weaken. He reached for the doorframe to steady himself. Mitchell continued, "The blood comes from voluntary donors. 13 million Americans have donated since 1941. We collect it at 2,500 donation centers nationwide, process it here, ship it to both theaters. Every American soldier who needs plasma gets plasma. No rationing, no shortages, no exceptions." Fischer was trying to breathe normally. His mind was racing through implications. If America could produce 1.8 million units of plasma annually, and if plasma saved lives at the rates he had observed during his capture, then America was saving hundreds of thousands of soldiers who would have died in any other army. The casualty replacement rates, the combat effectiveness, the strategic implications, everything he thought he understood about this war was wrong. Mitchell gestured toward the factory floor. "Come on, I will show you the warehouse. You start work tomorrow at 600. Fischer followed numbly. As they walked past the centrifuge stations, he saw women operating the machines with practiced efficiency, loading blood tubes, starting cycles, unloading separated plasma. Each woman probably processed 200 units per shift. There were perhaps 60 women visible on this floor alone. Fisher calculated, if 60 women processing 200 units each worked 3 shifts daily, that was 36,000 units daily. The number could not be right. It was too large. But he had just been told the facility produced 1,200 units daily, and he could see with his own eyes that the capacity existed for much more. In the warehouse, Fisher saw crates stacked to the ceiling. Each crate was labeled medical supplies, plasma dried, 100 units, destination, European theater or Pacific theater. He counted the crates in one section, over 300. That was 30,000 units waiting for shipment in one warehouse, in one city. Fisher felt dizzy. He sat down on a crate before his legs gave out. Mitchell looked concerned. "You okay, son? Need some water?" Fisher shook his head. He was not okay. He was experiencing the psychological collapse of understanding that Germany had lost this war before it started, that every German soldier's sacrifice had been meaningless because Germany was fighting an industrial colossus it could never match, that courage and training and tactics were irrelevant against a nation that could produce plasma like Germany produced bullets. "Sergeant Mitchell," Fisher said quietly, "how long has this facility been operating?" Mitchell checked his clipboard. Opened March 1st, 1942. About 19 months. Fisher looked up at the stacks of crates. "In 19 months, you have produced enough plasma to supply an army of millions." Mitchell nodded. "That's correct. Plus 4 other facilities producing similar amounts." Fisher's voice was barely a whisper. "Germany cannot compete with this. We do not have the donors. We do not have the processing capacity. We do not have the logistics. If this is how America fights wars, through industrial organization of everything including mercy, then we have already lost." Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Fisher would remember for the rest of his life. "Son, America did not want this war. We tried to stay out, but when we committed completely. We decided that if we were going to fight, we would fight with every advantage we could create, including making sure our soldiers do not die from preventable causes. This factory is not about defeating Germany. This factory is about saving Americans." But yeah, the side effect is that you cannot win, because we will save our wounded faster than you can kill them. March 8th, 1942, 18 months earlier. The same Baxter facility was beginning operations for the first time. Margaret Chen arrived for her first night shift, not knowing she was about to become part of the most sophisticated medical logistics operation in human history. The machinery broke down at 02, 17 hours. Margaret heard the centrifuge before you saw it. The usual steady hum changed to a grinding shriek. She dropped her clipboard and ran toward Station 7. The centrifuge was shaking violently. Unbalanced tubes whipping around at 3,000 revolutions per minute. Margaret hit the emergency stop. The machines screamed to a halt. Glass tubes shattered. 12 units of blood, donated by 12 Americans somewhere in the Midwest, sprayed across the concrete floor. Margaret stared at the red puddle spreading toward the drain. 12 units lost, 12 soldiers who might need that blood. Her hands were shaking. She had been working at the plasma facility for exactly 9 days. This was her first major mistake. She thought she would be fired. thought she had failed. Her supervisor, Dorothy Klein, appeared beside her. Dorothy was 56 years old, a former textile factory manager who had been recruited to run the night shift at Baxter. She looked at the destroyed centrifuge, then at Margaret's face, then at the blood on the floor. Dorothy did not yell. She just said quietly, "How many units did we process tonight before this happened?" Margaret checked her clipboard. 643. Dorothy nodded. "So we lost 12. That is a 1.8% loss rate. Acceptable." She pointed at the ruined centrifuge. "What did you learn?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "The tubes were not balanced. I loaded them wrong. One side was heavier than the other." Dorothy put her hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Now you will never make that mistake again. Clean this up. Log the loss. Get back to work. We have 400 more units to process before shift change. At 0600 hours. The war does not stop because a machine broke." Margaret cleaned up the blood, filed the incident report, returned to her station. Her hands were still shaking. But she loaded the next batch of tubes perfectly, double-checking the weight balance before starting the centrifuge. By the end of her shift, she had processed another 89 units without error. She had learned the most important lesson of industrial production. Mistakes happen. You learn from them. Then you continue, because the work matters more than individual failures. By June 1942, Margaret Chen was processing 200 units per night shift without errors. Her hands had developed a steadiness that came from handling thousands of bottles. Her attention to detail came from knowing that every mistake meant a soldier might die. One night in the break room, she read a letter posted on the bulletin board. The Red Cross forwarded letters from soldiers thanking blood donors. This one was from a Marine corporal named James Mitchell, recovering at a Navy hospital in San Diego. Mitchell had been wounded at Guadalcanal, shot twice in the chest and once in the leg, had lost massive amounts of blood. Navy corpsmen gave him 4 units of plasma on the beach. Navy doctors gave him whole blood on the hospital ship. He survived. The letter was simple and devastating. "I do not know who donated the blood that saved my life. I do not know their names or where they live, but I want them to know that I am alive because of them. I am 20 years old. I am going to go home when this war is over. I am going to marry my girlfriend. I am going to have children. I am going to live a full life. And all of that is possible because someone in America took 30 minutes to donate blood. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart and the depths of my soul. Thank you." Margaret had cried when she read that letter. Had stood in the break room at 0300 hours crying while other workers pretended not to notice, because the letter confirmed what she had always hoped but never quite believed, that her work, her boring, repetitive factory work, was saving lives, that processing 200 units per shift was not just making quota, it was keeping Marines alive, that mathematics multiplied across millions of units meant hundreds of thousands of lives saved. That night, in the POW barracks, Fisher lay on his cot, unable to sleep. The other prisoners were talking about escape plans, about news from Germany, about when the war might end. Fisher said nothing. He was thinking about 1,200 units daily, about assembly lines processing blood, about women in Chicago working night shifts to save soldiers in Tunisia, about an industrial system so vast that it treated plasma production like automobile manufacturing. The prisoner in the next bunk, a Luftwaffe pilot named Hans Becker, noticed Fischer's silence. "Klaus, what is wrong? You have been quiet since you returned from the factory." Fischer rolled over to face him. "Hans, I saw something today that made me understand why we lost this war." Becker laughed. "We have not lost yet. The fatherland still fights." Fischer shook his head. "We lost in 1941, when we declared war on America. We just did not know it yet. Today I saw an American factory producing 1,200 units of blood plasma daily. One factory, Hans. One, and they have 5 of them. They are producing more medical supplies in 1 month than Germany produces in a year. We are not fighting a war. We are being buried under an avalanche of industrial capacity." The barracks fell quiet. Other prisoners were listening now. Becker spoke carefully. "You are saying Germany cannot win?" Fischer sat up. "I am saying Germany never could win. Not against this. The Americans have industrialized everything. They mass-produce mercy the same way they mass-produce tanks, and we cannot compete. Our soldiers die from shock because we lack plasma. Their soldiers survive because they have unlimited plasma. Over time, that difference is decisive. We lose trained men. They save them. The mathematics are inevitable. An older prisoner, an Oberst named Wilhelm Koch, who had been captured at Kasserine Pass, spoke from across the barracks. "The boy's right. I saw American medical facilities in Tunisia. They had more supplies in one field hospital than our entire Army Corps had for the Africa campaign. I thought it was an isolated advantage. But if they have factories producing plasma at this scale, then it is not isolated. It is systematic. They have solved military medicine through industrial organization." The prisoners were silent. Fischer lay back down. Tomorrow he would start working in the warehouse. He would move crates of plasma, load them onto trucks, watch them being shipped to ports for transport to Europe. And every day he would see the proof that Germany had been defeated not by better soldiers, but by better logistics, by a nation that refused to accept preventable death and built systems to make prevention possible. The war was lost. It had always been lost. The only question now was how many more would die before Germany accepted the arithmetic. June 6th, 1944, 06:32 hours, Omaha Beach, Dog Green Sector. Corporal Thomas Hernandez was dying in shallow water. The machine gun burst hit him 17 seconds after the landing craft ramp dropped. 3 rounds across his chest and shoulder. He remembered the impacts, like baseball bats swinging into his ribs. Then he was underwater, the weight of his equipment pulling him down, salt water flooding his nose and throat. His blood clouded the water around him, dark ribbons spreading in the foam. Private David Miller grabbed Hernandez by his webbing and dragged him toward a steel beach obstacle. Bullets cracked overhead. Mortar shells threw up geysers of sand and water. Bodies floated face down in the surf. Miller pulled Hernandez behind the obstacle and ripped open his jacket. Blood poured from the chest wounds, bright arterial red, pulsing with each heartbeat. Miller had seen this before in training films. Arterial bleeding. The instructors had been very clear. You have maybe 3 minutes before the brain shuts down from blood loss. After that, even if you stop the bleeding, the damage is permanent. Hernandez was going into shock. His lips were blue. His skin was the color of wet concrete. His eyes were unfocused and glassy. Miller tore open his medical pouch with shaking hands and pulled out a canvas bag marked "Plasma Dried," for use in shock. Inside was a bottle of yellow powder, a bottle of sterile water, rubber tubing, and a needle. Miller had practiced this exactly twice during training at Camp Bradford. The instructor had made it look easy. Dissolve the powder. Connect the tube. Find a vein. Simple. Miller's hands were shaking so violently, he dropped the water bottle. He grabbed it from the sand. Rinsed it in seawater. Hoped that was good enough. He punctured the seal and inverted the bottle into the cap of the powder bottle. Water flowed down. The powder began dissolving. Miller shook the bottle frantically. Come on, come on. Dissolve, you bastard. 30 seconds. The powder was completely dissolved. Clear yellow liquid. Miller attached the rubber tube, squeezed out the air, looked at Hernandez's arm. He needed a vein. Any vein. Hernandez's veins were collapsed from blood loss, barely visible under grey skin. Miller felt frantically for the antecubital vein in the elbow crease. There, he thought he felt it. He jabbed the needle in. Missed, tried again. The needle slid into the vein. Blood flashed back into the tube. He had it. Miller opened the clamp. Plasma began flowing into Hernandez's bloodstream at roughly 60 drops per minute, the rate they had been taught in training. He held the tea bottle up above Hernandez's heart, using his own body to shield them both from machine gun fire that was still tearing through the air around them. For 45 seconds, nothing happened. Hernandez's breathing remained shallow and rapid. His eyes stayed unfocused. Miller thought he was watching his friend die. Then slowly, Hernandez blinked. His eyes focused on Miller's face. Color began returning to his cheeks, just a faint flush of pink under the gray. His breathing deepened. He coughed, spraying blood and salt water. "What?" Hernandez whispered. "What the hell?" "Shut up," Miller said. His voice was shaking. "Just shut up and breathe." 4 minutes after being shot through the chest, Thomas Hernandez was conscious and stabilizing. His wounds were still catastrophic. He still needed surgery. But he was not dying. Not right now. The plasma had restored enough blood volume to keep his heart pumping, his brain functioning, his organs alive. He had time. Miller held that bottle for another 6 minutes until it was empty. Then he flagged down a medic, a corporal from the 16th Infantry Regiment, who was moving along the beach, treating casualties. The medic took one look at Hernandez, nodded approval at Miller's plasma administration, gave Hernandez a shot of morphine, tagged him for evacuation. Priority 1. Immediate surgical intervention required. 2 hours later, Hernandez was on a landing craft heading back to a hospital ship. He would undergo surgery that afternoon. He would spend 3 weeks recovering aboard the USS Akana. He would eventually be sent to a hospital in England, then back to the States. He would survive the war. He would return to his family in Texas. He would live another 47 years, dying peacefully in 1991 at age 68. All because David Miller remembered his training and successfully administered 1 bottle of dried plasma on a beach in France while people were trying to kill them both. What Miller did not know was that his actions were being repeated hundreds of times across Omaha Beach that morning, soldiers using plasma to save each other. The dried plasma that had seemed like an unnecessary burden during training, that extra weight in already overloaded packs, was proving to be the most important equipment they carried, more important than ammunition, more important than grenades, because you could take ammunition from a dead man, but you could not take back his blood. June 6th, 1944, 09:47 hours, Battalion Aid Station, 600 yards inland from Omaha Beach. Captain Robert Pierce was performing surgery on a tree stump. The aid station was supposed to be a proper medical facility. Tents, equipment, organization. But the landing had been so chaotic that Pierce and his team had barely made it off the beach alive. They had set up wherever they could find cover. Right now, that meant a small depression in the ground, surrounded by hedgerows, using a sawed-off tree stump as an operating table. The wounded were everywhere, lying in the grass, propped against trees, some screaming, some silent, some unconscious. Pierce counted at least 60 casualties within visual range, and more were arriving constantly. Litter bearers stumbled in from the beach, carrying men on stretchers, dropped them, and ran back for more. Pierce moved among the wounded, performing triage. This one needs immediate surgery. This one can wait. This one is beyond help. He marked each man with colored tags: red for immediate, yellow for delayed, black for expectant, the medical term for those expected to die. The black tags destroyed Pierce. These were men who might survive with proper facilities, but here, with limited supplies and no shelter, they were going to die. Then Pierce noticed something strange. Men he had tagged black were not dying. They were stabilizing. He approached one. A sergeant shot through the abdomen. Pierce had tagged him black 20 minutes earlier. Massive internal bleeding. No way to stop it without surgery. And Pierce had 6 men ahead of him requiring surgery. The sergeant should be unconscious by now, should be minutes from death. But the sergeant was conscious, talking. His color was poor but not critical. Pierce checked his arm. Someone had started a plasma infusion. The bottle was nearly empty, held up by a stick wedged into the ground. Pierce looked around. Who started this plasma? A private raised his hand. He looked terrified. I did, sir. Was that wrong? He was dying. I remembered the training. So I did it. Pierce stared at the private. You probably just saved his life. The sergeant needs surgery, but the plasma bought him time. Keep that bottle elevated until it is empty. Then start another one if you have it. The private nodded, looking relieved. Pierce moved through the casualties again, this time specifically checking for plasma infusions. He found 17 men receiving plasma, administered not by medics but by other soldiers, by friends, by strangers, by anyone who remembered the training and had the courage to try. And those 17 men were alive because of it. By noon, Pierce's aid station had established something resembling order. They had erected 2 surgical tents. They had organized supply dumps. They had prioritized casualties and established an evacuation chain. And they had used 143 units of plasma. Pierce had started the day with 200 units. He was running low. He radioed back to the beach. This is Aid Station Charlie. We need plasma resupply. Minimum 500 units. Urgent. The response came back within 5 minutes. Resupply en route. ETA 30 minutes. Pierce was shocked. 30 minutes. How was that possible? The resupply jeep arrived at 12:38 hours. The driver, a private from the Quartermaster Corps, unloaded 6 wooden crates marked medical supplies, plasma dried 100 units per crate, 600 units. Pierce stared at the crates. Where did this come from? The private shrugged. Beach supply dump, sir. We got about 12,000 units down there. Maybe more. They keep bringing it in on landing craft, priority cargo, 12,000 units on Omaha Beach. Pierce tried to process that number. 12,000 units meant they could treat 12,000 casualties before running out. The pre-invasion planning had anticipated every possible scenario. and over-prepared for all of them. Someone, somewhere, had done the mathematics, estimated casualties, calculated plasma requirements, and then doubled it just to be safe. Pierce returned to surgery. He operated continuously until 1900 hours, 13 hours of surgery without a real break. By the end of the day, his aid station had treated 284 casualties. Of those, 247 survived. 37 died. That was an 87% survival rate. Pierce had never achieved numbers like that in training exercises, much less in combat conditions. June 6th, 1944, 14:13 hours. German medical bunker, Pont du Hoc, 800 meters from Omaha Beach. Stabsarzt Heinrich Müller pressed his back against the concrete wall as the bunker shook from another naval bombardment. Dust fell from the ceiling. The electric lights flickered and died. In the darkness, wounded German soldiers screamed. Müller had been a military surgeon for 3 years. He had served in Russia, where he had learned that war was not about glory or heroism. War was about logistics. The side with more supplies, more ammunition, more medical equipment, more everything, usually won. And right now, Germany had almost nothing. Müller's medical bunker was supposed to serve as an aid station for the entire defensive sector. It had been stocked with enough supplies for maybe 50 casualties over several days. But the invasion had started 8 hours ago, and Müller had already treated 73 casualties. He had used all 6 units of stored blood in the first 2 hours. After that, he performed direct transfusions, taking blood from lightly wounded soldiers and giving it to critical cases. The process was slow, dangerous, and often failed. The worst part was not the lack of blood. The worst part was knowing that the Americans, just a few hundred meters away, had unlimited blood. Müller had been captured briefly at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia before escaping during a counterattack. He had seen American medical facilities. He had seen their supplies, refrigerators full of plasma, crates of morphine, surgical equipment. They had everything, and they used it on everyone, even German prisoners. At 14:30 hours, the bunker took a direct hit from a naval shell. The explosion collapsed the entrance. The generator was destroyed. In the darkness, Müller heard men crying for help. He fumbled for his flashlight. The beam revealed carnage. 3 wounded soldiers killed instantly by the blast. 4 more wounded by falling concrete. The surgical table were buried. The medical supplies were scattered. Müller and his assistant, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber, dug through the rubble trying to reach the trapped wounded. They pulled out 2 men, both in severe shock from blood loss. Müller had no plasma, no blood, nothing to restore their blood volume. He could only apply pressure to their wounds and hope. Both men died within 10 minutes. Not from their wounds directly, but from shock. Their bodies simply gave up. Müller sat on the floor of the ruined bunker, his hands covered in blood, and tried not to think about the fact that those 2 men would have survived if they had been American. The Americans would have given them plasma immediately, would have evacuated them to a field hospital, would have performed surgery with proper equipment. Those men died because they were German, and Germany could not organize medical logistics. At 16:30 hours, Müller received orders to evacuate. American infantry was overrunning the position. He and Weber gathered what supplies remained and fled through a secondary exit. They left behind 14 wounded Germans who were too critical to move. Müller knew those men would be captured, and he knew with absolute certainty that the Americans would treat them better than he had been able to. 2 days later, Müller would encounter some of those wounded Germans in an American POW collection point. They had all survived, all 14. The Americans had given them plasma, evacuated them to field hospitals, performed surgery, and were now holding them as prisoners. One of them, a private named Hans Schultz, told Müller what had happened. "The Americans just treated us like their own wounded sir. They gave us plasma. They gave us morphine. They operated on me for 3 hours. The surgeon was American, but he worked just as hard on me as he would on one of his own men. I do not understand it." Müller understood it. The Americans had so many supplies that they could afford to save everyone, even enemies. It was not mercy, it was industrial capacity. They had produced so much medical equipment that using it on German POWs did not even strain their system. That realization was more demoralizing than any battlefield defeat. Germany was not losing because its soldiers were less brave. Germany was losing because America had turned war into an industrial process, and Germany could not compete. August 15th, 1945, 14:23 hours, USS Comfort, hospital ship, Philippine Sea, 140 miles east of Tokyo. Pharmacist's mate, second class, Robert Chen, stared at the empty blood bank refrigerator and felt his stomach drop. Empty, completely empty. Every shelf, every rack, not a single bottle of plasma, not a single unit of whole blood. The stainless steel interior gleamed under the fluorescent lights, mocking him with its emptiness. Chen had been managing this blood bank for 8 months without ever running out. Now, for the first time, he had failed. The USS Comfort had received 1,247 casualties in the past 9 days. 9 days of kamikaze attacks following the Hiroshima bombing, 9 days of burn victims and blast injuries and traumatic amputations. Chen's blood bank had started with 2,800 units on August 6th. He had rationed carefully. He had tracked every transfusion. He had calculated that supplies would last until August 18th, when the scheduled resupply was due. But Japan's surrender announcement had triggered the most violent kamikaze attacks of the entire war. Pilots who knew the war was ending had launched suicide missions in final acts of desperation. Yesterday alone, 4 ships had been hit. The USS Comfort had received 340 new casualties. Chen had used the last unit of blood at 13:47 hours, 36 minutes ago. And there were still 89 patients requiring surgery that could not be performed without blood. Chen ran through the corridors, his shoes squeaking on the deck plates. He found Captain Thomas Warren, the chief medical officer, in Operating Theatre 3. Warren was elbow deep in a sailor's chest cavity, repairing damage from a kamikaze strike. Chen waited until Warren looked up. "Sir, we are out of blood." "Completely out." Warren's hands never stopped moving. "How many casualties require immediate transfusion?" Chen checked his clipboard. 17 critical. Another 72 will need blood for scheduled surgeries. Warren nodded once. "Tell the surgeons to delay all non-critical operations. Use saline where possible. I will call Fleet Medical." 5 minutes later, Warren was on the bridge telephone. "This is USS Comfort, Captain Warren. We've exhausted all blood supplies. Current inventory 0. I have 17 critical casualties and no blood to give them." His voice was steady, but Chen could hear the tension underneath. What is your resupply, ETA? The voice on the other end belonged to Commander Michael Harrison, Fleet Medical Logistics, USS Comfort. We are already en route to your position. Two R-5D transport aircraft launched from Okinawa 47 minutes ago. ETA to your location, 3 hours 20 minutes. They are carrying 4,000 units whole blood, 2,000 units plasma. Prepare for airdrop delivery. Warren was silent for 3 seconds. Commander, did you say you launched 47 minutes ago? That was before I called. How did you know we needed resupply? Harrison's voice had a trace of satisfaction. Captain, we've been tracking blood usage across all hospital ships since the Hiroshima bombing. When kamikaze attacks intensified on August 13th, we calculated projected depletion rates for every vessel. The USS Comfort's usage pattern indicated you would reach critical levels between 1,400 and 1,500 hours today. We launched preemptive resupply at 1336 hours. The blood was in the air before you opened an empty refrigerator. Warren hung up and looked at Chen. 3 hours. Keep everyone alive for 3 hours. Chen wanted to ask how that was possible when 17 men needed blood right now, but Warren was already walking back to surgery. Chen returned to the medical wards and began the most difficult 3 hours of his life. He moved from bed to bed, checking vital signs, adjusting IV drips, talking to conscious patients, lying to them. You're doing fine. The doctors will operate soon. We have everything we need. The lies felt like acid in his throat. 17 men were sliding into shock because their bodies did not have enough blood to maintain blood pressure, and Chen could do nothing but watch. At 16:12 hours, a sailor named James Morrison went into cardiac arrest. Chen and 2 other corpsmen performed CPR for 11 minutes. Morrison's heart restarted twice and stopped twice. Without blood, his body simply could not sustain itself. At 16:23 hours, Morrison died. He was 19 years old, from Oregon. He had survived the kamikaze strike that killed 8 of his shipmates. He had survived the initial surgery. And he died because the USS Comfort ran out of blood 76 minutes before resupply arrived. Chen stood over Morrison's body, shaking with rage and grief. 76 minutes. If the planes had launched 1 hour earlier, Morrison would be alive. But they had not, and he was dead. At 17:27 hours, lookouts spotted the aircraft. 2 Navy R-5D transports flying at 600 feet, their engines thundering across the water. They circled the USS Comfort once, then began their drop. Parachutes blossomed. 24 parachutes, each carrying a waterproof container painted bright orange. The containers splashed into the ocean in a wide pattern. Small boats launched immediately from the ship. Chen stood on deck, watching the recovery operation. Other sailors and Marines, the walking wounded, had come on deck to watch. They understood what was happening, that orange parachutes meant life, that those containers held blood donated by people in America who had no idea their blood was currently splashing into the Philippine Sea. But it was here, and men would live because of it. By 18:04 hours, all 24 containers were recovered. Chen supervised the unloading in the blood bank. Each container held 175 to 200 units of whole blood packed in crushed ice and insulated wrapping. The bottles were still cold, still perfect. Chen started stocking the refrigerators, his hands moving mechanically. Captain Warren appeared in the doorway. How many did we lose? Chen did not look up. 1. Morrison, cardiac arrest at 16:23. Warren was quiet for a long moment. If the resupply had been delayed another hour, we would have lost all 17. We saved 16 out of 17. That is the best we could do. Chen finally looked at Warren. His eyes were wet. Sir, Morrison died because we ran out of blood for 76 minutes. That should never happen. We should never run out. Warren stepped into the blood bank and put his hand on Chen's shoulder. Son, you just witnessed something that no other military in history could achieve. We ran out of blood on a hospital ship 6,000 miles from California, and we received resupply via airdrop in 3 hours. The blood you are holding was donated in San Francisco 6 days ago. It flew across an ocean. It was dropped from an airplane into the sea, and now it is going to save 16 men. No other nation on earth could do this. Not Britain, not the Soviets, and absolutely not Japan. Chen wanted to argue, wanted to say that one death was still a failure. But Warren was already leaving. Chen finished stocking the refrigerators and returned to the wards. 16 men were being prepared for surgery. They would receive transfusions. They would survive, because plasma bottles had arrived in time. Barely. What Chen did not know was that the USS Comfort's blood crisis had been anticipated not just hours in advance, but weeks in advance, that the entire Pacific blood supply system had been redesigned in 1943 specifically to prevent exactly this scenario. February 1943. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Commander Eugene Harris stood in a warehouse staring at a problem that could lose the Pacific War. The problem was blood. Specifically, how to deliver blood across distances that made European supply lines look trivial. The Pacific Theater was not a battlefield. It was an ocean. 64 million square miles of ocean containing thousands of islands, hundreds of ships, and tens of thousands of soldiers spread across distances greater than the continental United States. Harris had been appointed Chief Medical Logistics Officer for the Pacific Fleet in January. His job was to ensure adequate medical supplies for all naval and marine forces. Everything else had established supply chains, ammunition, food, fuel, equipment. But blood was different. Blood spoiled in 7 days even with perfect refrigeration. Blood required temperatures between 2 and 6 degrees Celsius. Blood could not be stockpiled indefinitely, and blood was absolutely critical. Without it, wounded men died. With it, they survived. The mathematics were brutal and simple. The distances were staggering. From blood collection centers in California to forward combat zones was 6,000 to 8,000 miles. Transport by ship took 3 weeks. By the time blood reached the front lines, it was expired. Useless. Harris had watched the Guadalcanal campaign with growing horror as Marines died from shock because medical units had no blood supplies. The plasma they received was often expired. The whole blood never arrived at all. The supply system had failed completely. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, had summoned Harris to his office in early February and asked one question. Commander, can you build a blood supply system that works in the Pacific? Harris had answered honestly, Sir, I do not know if it is possible, but if we do not try, we will lose more men to bad logistics than we lose to Japanese bullets. Nimitz had nodded. Then make it possible. You have unlimited resources and my full authority. Do not fail. Harris spent 6 weeks studying the problem. He visited hospitals. He interviewed surgeons. He calculated casualty rates and blood usage patterns. He studied maps and shipping routes and aircraft ranges, and slowly a solution emerged. It was audacious, it was expensive, and it violated every principle of traditional military logistics. But it might work. Harris presented his plan to Nimitz on March 18, 1943. The proposal filled 87 pages, but the core ideas were simple. First, every major warship would carry a blood bank with specialized refrigeration. Second, every captured island would receive blood supplies within 48 hours of securing the beach. Third, submarines would deliver blood to isolated positions. And fourth, most radically, the Navy would use aircraft to deliver blood via airdrop when traditional shipping was too slow. Nimitz read the proposal in silence. When he finished, he looked at Harris. "Commander, do you understand what you're proposing? You want to dedicate submarines, our most valuable and limited asset, to transporting blood. You want to modify aircraft for medical supply drops. You want to install expensive refrigeration equipment on every ship in the fleet. This will cost millions of dollars." Harris met his gaze. "Sir, it will cost approximately $8.4 million for full implementation. But if it saves 10,000 lives, that is $840 per life saved. Can you tell the parents of a dead sailor that their son's life was not worth $840? Nimitz signed the authorization that afternoon. The implementation began immediately. The Navy Blood Bank opened at Pearl Harbor on April 12, 1943. The facility received blood flown from California collection centers in refrigerated aircraft. Commercial aircraft, requisitioned for military use, flew daily routes from San Francisco to Hawaii, carrying blood as priority cargo. The blood arrived fresh, was tested and processed at Pearl Harbor, then distributed to the fleet. But the real innovation was submarine blood delivery. The idea sounded insane. Submarines were designed to sink enemy ships, not deliver medical supplies. But submarines had advantages. They could travel submerged, avoiding air attacks. They could reach isolated islands through Japanese-controlled waters, and with proper refrigeration, they could transport blood safely. In May 1943, the USS Gato received the first submarine blood bank installation. A specialized refrigerator replaced one torpedo in the forward torpedo room. The refrigerator could hold 400 units of blood and operate on the submarine's electrical system. The crew hated it. They called it the blood coffin. But on May 27, 1943, the USS Gato delivered 380 units of blood to Marines on Guadalcanal. The delivery succeeded. Marines received fresh blood for transfusions. The concept was proven. Over the next 2 years, 27 submarines would be modified with blood refrigerators. These submarines made 73 blood delivery runs to isolated positions across the Pacific, to Tarawa, to Saipan, to Peleliu, to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa. They delivered through Japanese waters under enemy air coverage with the same dedication they delivered ammunition, because blood was ammunition. Every unit saved a life. Every life saved was a Marine who could keep fighting. The system worked. It worked brilliantly. It worked beyond anyone's expectations. And on August 15, 1945, it worked one more time, delivering blood to the USS Comfort via airdrop across 6,000 miles in 3 hours. 16 men lived because of that delivery. James Morrison died. The system was not perfect. but it was the best any military had ever achieved, and that had to be enough. November 20th, 1945, Nuremberg, Germany. International Military Tribunal, Cell 23. Albert Speer could not sleep. Again. For the third night in a row, he lay on the narrow cot, staring at the concrete ceiling of his prison cell, thinking about numbers. Speer was Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production. He had overseen German industrial output from 1942 until the end of the war. He had increased aircraft production by 300%. He had tripled tank output. He had done what everyone said was impossible. He had kept Germany's war machine running despite Allied bombing, despite material shortages, despite losing territory and resources. He had been a genius of industrial organization, the man who had almost won the war for Germany through pure productive efficiency. But 3 days ago, during his tribunal testimony, an American prosecutor named Robert Story had presented numbers that destroyed everything Speer thought he understood about the war, and Speer had been unable to stop thinking about those numbers since. The testimony had started normally. Story had asked about German production figures. Speer had answered proudly. In 1944, despite 3 years of war and constant bombing, Germany produced 40,000 aircraft, 27,000 tanks, 17,000 artillery pieces, and 8 million shells. These numbers represented peak German production, the highest output in our history. Story had nodded slowly. Then he had opened a file folder and read American production figures for the same year. 96,270 aircraft, 17,565 tanks, 23,000 artillery pieces, 41 million shells. He had looked up at Speer. Minister, you were outproduced by ratios ranging from 2 to 1 to 5 to 1. But let me ask about something else. How many units of blood plasma did Germany produce during the entire war? Speer had hesitated. That information was not compiled in my ministry. Medical supplies were handled separately, but I believe the number was approximately 30,000 units total from 1941 to 1945. Story had smiled. It was not a kind smile. The United States produced 13.3 million units of plasma during the same period. That is not twice your production, Minister Speer. That is 440 times your production. You produced 30,000 units. America produced 13.3 million. Do you understand what that means? The courtroom had been completely silent. Speer had felt something cold spreading through his chest. Story had continued, his voice precise and merciless. It means that for every wounded German soldier who received a blood transfusion, 440 wounded American soldiers received transfusions. It means that Germany's most efficient, most organized, most productive industrial system could not match even 1% of American medical production. It means, Minister Speer, that you were not competing in the same industrial league as America. You were not even playing the same game. Now, lying in his cell 3 days later, Speer replayed those numbers obsessively. 440 to 1, not 2 to 1, which could be overcome with better tactics, not 5 to 1, which could be offset with superior training, but 440 to 1, a ratio so overwhelming that no amount of German efficiency could have closed the gap, even if Speer had been twice as effective, 10 times as effective. Germany still would have been crushed. But the numbers that truly haunted Speer were not about production. They were about survival. Story had presented casualty statistics. German mortality rate for wounded soldiers, approximately 37%. American mortality rate, approximately 18%. The difference, nearly 20 percentage points, was almost entirely attributable to medical care, to plasma, to blood transfusions, to the industrial mercy that America had deployed as efficiently as it deployed bombers. Speer did the mathematics in his head. If Germany had achieved American survival rates, approximately 180,000 additional German soldiers would have survived their wounds. 180,000 trained soldiers who died not from enemy bullets, but from inadequate medical logistics. 180,000 men who could have kept fighting if Germany had matched American medical infrastructure. That was 15 infantry divisions, an entire army group, lost not on battlefields, but in field hospitals that lacked supplies. Speer finally understood why Germany had lost. It was not tactics. It was not even weapons production, though America had dominated there too. It was philosophy. Germany had treated soldiers as expendable resources. You produce soldiers. You sent them to battle. If they died, you produced more. The system was efficient in its brutality, but America had treated soldiers as irreplaceable assets. You saved the wounded. You returned them to combat. You refused to waste trained personnel. And over years of warfare, that difference compounded exponentially. Speer rolled over on his cot and stared at the wall. Tomorrow, he would testify again. The prosecutors would ask about slave labor, about concentration camps, about the moral failures of the Nazi regime. But Speer knew the real failure was simpler and more fundamental. Germany had been defeated by arithmetic, by an American industrial system so vast that it could waste more resources than Germany could produce, by a nation that could afford to give Coca-Cola to prisoners, ice cream to soldiers, and blood transfusions to anyone who needed them, including enemies. The war had been lost before it started. Germany had challenged a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity. The outcome had been inevitable. All the tactics and courage and sacrifice had only delayed the mathematics from resolving. January 15th, 1946. Presbyterian Hospital, New York City. Dr. Charles Drew sat in his office, reading a letter from the American Medical Association. The letter congratulated him on his wartime achievements and informed him that he was being considered for the organization's highest honor, the Distinguished Service Medal. The letter praised his revolutionary work in blood banking, his organization of the Blood for Britain program, his supervision of the American Red Cross blood program, and his contributions to military medicine. The letter was respectful, even effusive in its praise. But Drew knew he would never be invited to accept the medal at the AMA's annual conference in Atlanta, because the conference hotels did not allow black guests, because the conference dining rooms were segregated, because the AMA, while happy to honor his work, was not prepared to treat him as an equal to the white doctors he had trained. Drew put the letter down and looked at the photograph on his desk. It showed him with his wife Lenore and their 4 children. He thought about what he would tell them about his war work. How could he explain that he had created a system that saved 500,000 lives, but that system had required segregating blood by race, that he had fought to eliminate blood segregation and lost, that he had compromised his principles to save lives, and the compromise had worked, but the moral cost had been enormous. The blood segregation policy had been implemented in January 1942 Under pressure from the military and Southern politicians, blood from black donors was labeled AA for African American and kept separate from white blood. The policy had no scientific basis. Blood types were determined by antigens, not melanin. Type O blood from a black donor was identical to type O blood from a white donor. But science had been overruled by racism. Drew had argued against segregation from the beginning. In meetings with Red Cross administrators, in letters to military medical officers, in statements to the press, he had presented data. He had explained the science. He had pointed out that blood segregation complicated logistics, reduced efficiency, and had no medical justification. He had been ignored. The compromise had been bitter. Drew could have resigned in protest. His resignation would have made headlines. It would have drawn attention to the injustice, but it also would have slowed the blood program. And soldiers would have died because of that delay. So Drew had stayed. He had built the system despite its flaws. He had saved lives, even while accepting discrimination. And the decision had haunted him every day since. But Drew also knew the blood program had achieved something remarkable beyond saving lives. It had demonstrated that Black Americans were essential to the war effort, that their contributions were not peripheral but central, that they could organize, could work, could sacrifice as effectively as any other Americans. The blood program had collected donations from 13 million Americans. Approximately 1.8 million of those donors were Black. Their blood had been segregated, but it had still saved lives. And white soldiers wounded in combat had survived because Black civilians had donated blood. The recipients never knew. The donors never told them. But the mathematics of mercy had transcended the racism of the system. Drew picked up a different letter from his desk. This one was from a white Marine who had been wounded at Iwo Jima. The Marine had received plasma on the beach and survived. He was writing to thank the blood program. The letter included a sentence that Drew had read multiple times. I do not know who donated the blood that saved me. I do not know if they were rich or poor, young or old, white or Black, but I am alive because of them, and I will spend the rest of my life grateful. Drew thought about that sentence. The Marine did not know, but Drew knew. The plasma that saved that Marine had been drawn from the integrated national blood supply, processed in laboratories where Black and white workers worked side by side, and delivered to the Pacific without regard to the donor's race. The system had been segregated at collection, but it had been integrated at use, and that integration, forced by practical necessity, had proved the absurdity of segregation. Blood was blood. Life was life. March 3rd, 1946. Baxter Laboratories, Chicago. The last shift was ending. Margaret Chen stood in the now empty plasma processing facility, watching workers remove the final pieces of equipment. The centrifuges were being loaded onto trucks, destined for hospitals and pharmaceutical companies. The bottling equipment was being packed for shipment. The conveyor systems were being dismantled. The factory that had processed 1.4 million units of blood between 1942 and 1945 was being converted back to civilian production. Chen had worked at Baxter for 3 years, 11 months and 17 days. She had operated centrifuges, monitored plasma quality, supervised bottling operations, and trained new workers. She had worked night shifts, double shifts, and once, during a supply crisis in June 1944, a 36-hour shift without sleep. She had personally handled approximately 68,000 units of blood. Her hands had touched bottles that saved lives in Normandy, in the Philippines, in Germany, in Japan. She had been part of the largest medical logistics operation in human history, and now it was over. The equipment was gone. The workers had been laid off or reassigned. The urgency that had driven them for 4 years had evaporated with Japan's surrender. The factory that had run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 1,400 consecutive days, was silent. Dorothy Klein, Chen's supervisor and the woman who had trained her in March 1942, walked across the empty floor. The click of her shoes echoed in the cavernous space. She stopped next to Chen. "Do you remember your first day?" Chen nodded. "I destroyed 12 units because I loaded the centrifuge wrong. I thought I'd failed." Dorothy smiled. "You cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes. Then you came back and processed 89 units without a single mistake. I knew then that you would be one of my best workers." Chen looked around the empty facility. "Dorothy, did we actually save lives? Or were we just making product and hoping it mattered?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled a piece of paper from her pocket. It was a letter. The paper yellowed with age. "This came to the facility in September 1944. The Red Cross forwarded it to us." Dorothy handed the letter to Chen. Chen read it slowly. The letter was from a Navy doctor stationed on a hospital ship in the Pacific. It described treating casualties from a kamikaze attack. It detailed using plasma to save 17 sailors who otherwise would have died from shock, and it ended with a paragraph that Chen read twice. "The plasma we used was manufactured at Baxter Laboratories in Chicago. I know this because I checked the labels. Every bottle was processed between March and May 1944. Those bottles traveled 6,000 miles across an ocean to reach my ship, and they saved 17 lives. Please tell the workers at Baxter that their work mattered, that those plasma bottles were not just product. They were miracles in glass. They were life itself. And 17 families have their sons and fathers and brothers because women in Chicago worked night shifts in a factory. Please tell them. Thank you from all of us." Chen finished reading and handed the letter back to Dorothy. Her hands were shaking. 17 lives in one attack from our facility. Dorothy nodded. That was one ship, on one day, in one theater. The Pacific Fleet used approximately 400,000 units from our facility. The European theater used another 600,000, over 1 million units. Chen, we saved approximately 80,000 lives. That is our production number. 80,000 people are alive because you showed up for work. Because you learned to operate a centrifuge. Because you worked night shifts when you were exhausted. Because you cared about getting it right. Chen was crying. She could not help it. Dorothy put her arm around her shoulders. "The company is keeping me on to manage pharmaceutical production. They offered you a position too. Will you stay?" Chen nodded, unable to speak. Dorothy continued. "Good, because someone needs to remember what we did here. This building saved 80,000 lives. Most people will never know. There will be no parades for factory workers, no medals for women who processed blood. But we know, and that has to be enough. September 2020, COVID-19 pandemic. American Red Cross Blood Donation Center, Detroit, Michigan. The line stretched around the block. People stood 6 feet apart, wearing masks, waiting to donate blood. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Blood supplies were critical, and Americans had responded to the call, just like they had in 1942. Sarah Chen, great-granddaughter of Margaret Chen, worked as a phlebotomist at the center. She was drawing blood from a donor, a young woman named Jennifer Martinez. Jennifer had never donated before. "First time?" Sarah asked. Jennifer nodded. "My grandmother survived cancer because of a blood transfusion. I wanted to give back." Sarah smiled. "That is why most people donate, because someone they loved needed blood, and they want to help others the same way." As Sarah worked, she thought about her great-grandmother. Margaret Chen had processed blood at Baxter Laboratories during World War II, had saved 80,000 lives through her work, had helped build the system that made this moment possible. Sarah had never met her great-grandmother. Margaret had died when Sarah was 6, but Sarah had inherited her great-grandmother's commitment to the work, to the belief that saving lives was worth the effort. The donation took 12 minutes. Sarah handed Jennifer juice and cookies. "You just saved up to 3 lives," Sarah said. "Your blood will be separated into components: red cells, platelets, plasma. Each component goes to a different patient." Jennifer was amazed. 3 lives from one donation. Sarah nodded. "That is the efficiency of modern blood banking. We waste nothing. Every drop matters." What Jennifer did not know was that the system she had just participated in was a direct descendant of the World War II blood program. That every procedure Sarah had followed, from blood typing to sterile collection to component separation, traced its origins to innovations developed between 1941 and 1945. That the efficiency she had just witnessed was the legacy of people like Charles Drew and Margaret Chen and Helen Kowalski, people who had built the factory of mercy during a war, and that factory was still running, still saving lives, still proving that organized compassion was the ultimate victory. The blood war ended in 1945, but the arithmetic of mercy never stopped calculating. 512,000 lives saved during the war, millions more in the decades since, and the counting continued. One donation, one bottle, one transfusion, one life, added together, compounded over generations, creating a legacy that would last as long as people remembered that saving lives was worth the effort. That mercy, when industrialized and deployed with ruthless efficiency, was more powerful than any weapon. That humanity, organized, was invincible. The factory that won the war was not in Detroit building tanks. It was in blood donation centers across America, in processing laboratories, in hospital ships and field hospitals and aid stations, in the hearts of people who gave freely because others needed what they could provide. That factory still runs today, still produces miracles, still saves lives. And as long as it continues, the war will never truly be over, because the real victory was not defeating enemies, it was building a system that refused to accept preventable death. And that system, once created, could never be unmade. It was permanent. It was American. It was the arithmetic of mercy. And it had won.